Look, I'm honestly not one to fall for topical media nonsense, which, for the lack of a better word, is the summarization of most forms of traditional media in India today. But I'm going to try and explain and uncover the history of drugs in India and try to probe into why it's a moral wrong in today's society. And I know you can't see it, but I'm trying my level best to make sure my air quotes on the word moral come out right in audio, but it is what it is, I guess. To be clear, Indians have grown drugs for centuries before us. Drugs are a casual part of Indian mythology to some extent. However, today's rules of Indian culture dictate that pleasure inducing drugs like marijuana, opium, LSD, and whatnot are just moral wrongs, despite what they do or don't physically do to your body. However, interestingly, a similar degree of shade isn't ever thrown at alcohol or tobacco as much as it is on what's collectively just called drugs or hard drugs. Sure, they're disregarded by some people, but are celebrated by most. And this is one of those problems I have with Indian culture. And I think I'm reasonably patriotic when I say this, but Indian culture has always been a set of rules that have started with a don't, where I have never found something identifying with Indian culture as much as I have seen a part of Indian culture not identifying with an act. Like, this is not Indian culture, that is not Indian culture. Which leads to a very weird existential sort of question, saying what exactly is Indian culture that does not just seem like it's right out of a fairy tale, I guess. Let's take the example of Indians inventing the Book of Love and yet centuries later just creating a random social taboo or stigma around love and sexual relations. And that's been around for years. It's weird. Like, you'd think a society that took pride in how they express love would be more open to talk about it. And I think a similar story goes for something like drugs too. The topic of drugs has always been an emotionally charged issue around the world. Every society in this world has its choice of drugs that they think are fine, may it be opium, tobacco, marijuana, alcohol, but are convinced that those of the other societies are depraved, degenerate. We call people who have them junkies, as the Americans did. So, our little journey through moral debauchery, as it were, is going to revolve around two very separate stories. And disclaimer, most of these stories occur outside of India, but they hold a lot of importance and influence on how they manifest themselves in our laws and culture today. So, the first of these stories takes after the East India Company, the British Empire, and the Chinese Qing Empire. And I'm sorry for butchering the pronunciation of any Chinese words I say here today, or in any other podcast, but yeah, if someone can correct me, that would be great. So, let's start with this. Throughout the 1700s, Indians grew opium and traded a lot of opium with the Chinese, where it became a fad, it became addictive and a highly sought after item. The Chinese basically loved smoking opium. Indians supplied a lot of opium. And opium is what morphine and heroin are made of. Opium seeds, or poppy seeds as they're called, are still legal in India. In fact, India is the largest cultivator of opium even now for medicinal use. And I have a feeling there's like an entire drug racket going on, but that's just a conspiracy theory at this point. The Chinese government didn't really know how to respond to this growing love for this weird foreign plant that people were just buying left and right. And that sort of behavior is not unprecedented. Well, technically I don't know what the word is for something that's happened recently, but has effects in the past. A cool analogy to understand why any government would have no idea what to do about something new and foreign, and why often there's like some level of pushback rather than acceptance, is the Bitcoin rage that hit the world in like 2017. Over the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen the entire Bitcoin rage take up the entire world, basically run into a deficiency of GPUs as people basically mined Bitcoin left and right, and governments having entirely no clue as to what to do about it, because it's currency, but of not the legal kind, but not illegal either, and currency that people can just get out of computing power. So people are not exactly working for it other than just converting the currency they have in terms of an electricity bill into another currency, which then valued itself to like 34,000 US dollars. So over the last 3 or 4 years, in fact, over the last decade, since when Bitcoin has been around, um, a bunch of countries have had very different rules. Most countries that generally like keeping control of their money and like keeping control of the money with a few individuals, as it were, like China, they have banned any form of Bitcoin sale, and local exchanges have also like closed down. And countries with high corruption, high tax evasion rates have also banned Bitcoin. But some other countries have been very open about it, like Australia, which basically removed bitcoins from double taxation, and the government also legalized it as like legal tender and said it can be used as like money. India has sort of been in the middle of that, where they've said it's not legal tender, but they have taken away the RBI ban on it, which was set in like earlier in this year. There's no laws about how it can be used. It's still very prohibitive, as if you're not allowed to exchange it, or you're not allowed to use it as legal tender. But yeah, you see the confusion here, right? There's a lot of laws around Bitcoin around the world, and they're very, very different depending on the landscape. So when any new drug enters the society, so to speak, or any new fad at this point, it creates this weird transition phase beyond which it is either embraced or forsaken, for the lack of a better word. You have people with the conventional mentality who think that people who consume these newfangled drugs are junkies and this is the bridge they'd never cross. And then you have the people who adopt the influx of this new drug. And eventually it sort of comes down to whether the government thinks they can control any of this. And the Chinese government didn't. The Qing government pushed back on the sale of opium in the country, and they were met with resistance from the British. Now this is a very weird part of the story, because if you don't have any context of India at the time, which the Chinese sort of did but also didn't, because the East India Company existed in India at the time, but it was a company, it was not the British Empire. So having the British mainland have a problem with this was kind of unprecedented for the Chinese as well. Now the British in the late 1830s, stormed in with their ships into the Canton region of China to force the hand of the Chinese government to stop them from banning opium sale. And this was called the First Opium War. It's kind of hard to imagine, at this point anyway, to have a war for opium, or to just have a war for drug. But it shouldn't exactly come as a surprise, because just like oil is a big commodity today, opium was a big commodity at the time. So this struggle for open trade between India and China continued for about 2 decades, until what became the Second Opium War of 1856, in which an allied army of the British, the French, and even the Russians essentially invaded Beijing and forced the Qing emperor to legalize the sale of opium, and they set up their own trading posts and everything. The thing is, the British didn't exactly have a stake in India yet. I mean, they did, but not officially. So why were they so passionate about keeping this trade channel open? Except for the part that East India Company was earning a lot off of this. It's unfathomable in today's age to think that one would go so far in length to sort of make sure a country doesn't ban the sale of something. Of course, the British at the time insisted on the principles of free trade, equal diplomatic recognition among nations, and backed the merchants' demand, saying, the merchants want to sell something, why don't you want to buy it if your people want it? And basically said that you should follow the rules of free economy, even though it should completely be up to you. Look, I always feel like I'm reading a statement of propaganda when I talk about a country invading anything based on restoration of a principle. The reasons were obviously more economical, or as it turns out, heavily based around pride. The British relied on the Chinese a lot for a lot of trade. And after American independence in the West, which was around this time, they had shifted their attention further to the Asian side of their empire, particularly towards India, because, well, India was the British cash cow, which is pretty ironic. The British had a large demand for Chinese tea, which comes as no surprise. The Chinese were a weird bunch in their Western regard though, set in their own ways, only trading through a very small center outside the gates of Canton, and restricted to being conducted through a handful of government authorized merchants. resulting in a trade balance that was unfavorable to the British. Alongside that, the Chinese only traded in gold and silver coins. Basically, you could not buy from the Chinese using a barter system, you just had to pay in gold and silver coins. And on the one hand, the British didn't have anything that the Chinese wanted. The East India Company had opium, which was in high demand in China, and the British didn't want to spend their gold and silver to buy the tea that they wanted off the Chinese. And so, they wanted market control and more free trade between the East India Company and China. So, the British tried to reason it with the Qing government at first, and this basically sets up the First Opium War in a very big way. So, pay attention. They sent in 3 sets of delegations spaced out over time, which was close to a decade. And one of them is famously known as the Napier Fizzle, or the Napier Incident. And I'm going to read this verbatim as I first read it, because I want to get the eccentricity of this right. In July 1834, Napier arrived at the harbour of Whampoa in a British warship without receiving any prior permission from the Chinese government. This unauthorized entry into the Celestial Empire was followed by an approximately 2-month stay at Canton, for which an additional permit was required. During this period, Lord Napier, assuming himself to be the British representative of the Crown, refused to accept Hong merchants, which acted as middlemen between foreign traders and local authorities since 1720, as the proper channel of communications. Instead, he insisted on writing directly to Chinese officials. In his correspondence, Napier resolved to abandon the normal heading of PIN, which is petition, which implies subservience, in order to suggest equality between himself and the Chinese viceroy. After several attempts to deliver the letter at the city gate had been rejected, the situation escalated into a crisis. The Chinese stopped all trade with Britain and demanded Napier's immediate departure. Napier, in response, adopted some strong measures. He not only circulated in Canton a proclamation accusing the viceroy of ignorance and incompetence, but also ordered 2 British frigates to force a passage to Canton, where he was put under house arrest by the Canton government. Of course, the British took this as a call to arms, following up this aggressive stance with one that was even more aggressive, leading up to the First and subsequently the Second Opium War. Now, I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but think about anything like this happening today. Someone shows up to Mumbai docks one day, without a passport, without the visa, somehow manages to get past security, stays for 2 months, writes strongly worded letters, or in today's age probably like tweets 24/7 to the chief minister, and then tries to enter his office and meet him face to face for a sit down. And when he's obviously thrown out many times, he calls the chief minister a beacon of ignorance and incompetence, and orders the people of his land to come attack the city. This sounds unrealistic today because the number of people who probably tweet at the authorities every day and or are as eccentric is many, but you get my point. The Chinese had a problem with breaking the rules of hierarchy, sure, but it wasn't like they weren't provoked. As a result of these events, leading up to the end of the 19th century, opium was pretty much the most traded commodity of India, and the British government had set up a whole system to formalize this trade and standardize trades for princely states that weren't part of the British government too. The East India Company had seized monopoly of the opium trade and basically handed it over to the British government, so anyone in India was technically free to have a hand at exporting opium for a pass fee that was paid to the British. That was only for princely states though, considering any opium trade that happened under British guardianship in India filled the pockets of the British only, pretty much. You'd think the farmers are getting a fair trade out of it, but with the stories of the high amounts of taxes we had heard about the British, I doubt that. Now, by 1860, the British, in conjunction with powers like the French and the Russians, had sort of policed China into letting in opium and keeping its sale going. But in a few decades, people back at the British mainland start developing concerns about how opium is super not good for people to be consuming in such high quantities. And there is no proof of moral justification on the sale of opium anywhere. And mind you, this is coming from a set of Christian communities in the British mainland, which put pressure on the British government to make sure that the entire empire follows the Christian way of living. So, and that comes with its own set of stigmas and its own set of stereotypes. So, having the Chinese smoking opium so much makes it look like opium is a bad thing and makes it look like it's a bad image for the British Empire, which leads to this kind of movement. So, in 1893, which is quite a long time after, a royal commission was set up for reporting on whether the British Empire should stop the trading of opium in the Far East, which is India, and in fact whether it should be sold in India or not at all. The commission conducted a very large survey over the course of almost 3 years and came up with the following controversial landmark decision. As the result of a searching inquiry, and upon a deliberate review of the copious evidence submitted to us, we feel bound to express our conviction that the movement in England in favour of active interference on the part of the Imperial Parliament for the suppression of the opium habit in India has proceeded from an exaggerated impression as to the nature and extent of the evil to be controlled. The gloomy descriptions presented to British audiences of extensive moral and physical degradation by opium have not been accepted by the witnesses representing the people of India, nor by those most responsible for the government of the country. The conclusion pretty much said, we don't want your interference on this opium business, because neither the consumers nor the traders of opium see it as a moral problem, let alone the British who profit from it. The commission also made the case that the financial sacrifice of Indians would be futile because the Chinese domestic opium production was also starting to take off, and if at any point Indian shipments stopped, their production would just increase to fill up the demand. For that matter, if the Qing Emperor could just call for a ban on opium sale, that would still just be that. The British government back in their mainland had since come out and said that they will not force China to keep accepting opium. Therefore, having taken the high road on that front, the Chinese emperor could just ban the trade of opium at all, and the ban wouldn't do much to the economy. Now, of course, you listen to the language of that conclusion statement, and one thing will stand out. This conclusion is vague and not particularly friendly to the anti-opium lobby that asked for this report in the first place. Naturally, the people back at the British mainland called bullshit on these claims, saying that the commission were neither concerned with Chinese smokers of opium, who this survey was really directed towards, nor was it anything but a PR move so that they could just keep the money rolling in from all the trade. And this debate on whether this commission was influenced or not, or on whether this report was legitimate or not, has continued for almost a century since, with statements cementing the report's exaggeration only surfacing in the late 1990s. So, something that sounds as aggressive must have been very evidently embellished, right? It just sounds so exaggerated. But, you'd think that's the case. I went in wondering what kept the debate going for this long. But we tend to underrepresent how important this survey was to the government of India, who were the main stakeholders to opium trade. Of course, consumers kept aside. However, that's not to say that the commission didn't work honestly. The commission wasn't influenced by the government of India, nor was it operating under their command. The commission did their job of conducting a survey among government officials, common folk, and local leaders, which is the Indian National Congress at the time, and found very few doubts about opium, and they barely needed to actually prompt people for their testimony. In fact, opinion in the Indian-owned English and regional language press outlets also expressed dissent over the prohibition of opium. The Madras Hindu, in its May 11, 1895 edition, wrote that opium may be a great evil, but national bankruptcy is a greater evil. The Royal Commission's final result was very close to the stance of the Government of India. But that wasn't the result of manipulation. There was a sense of agreement in the practicality of the policies of the government among the people and the local leaders. This was a mindset which was set on two things. One, the government was making money off of it, and some of that money was being used for making progress in India. Two, there was some cultural value to the use of opium for people in India. for most people, opium was never a central issue. It was never public enemy number one. It was just part of their culture, part of how they lived. Most anti-opium reformers sensationalized the harm done by it and tried to reduce the cost to Indians for getting rid of it by just giving rebates to the Indian government and the amount of tax that it would lose. In doing this, they ignored the sensibilities of the people for whom this was in fact just a part of their culture. The reformers were bound by their own ethno-cultural values, and most of them didn't live in India or were Indians either. I don't expect someone like that to understand, but when you're making a decision for a country that's based on people that are not like you, having someone who has some stake in that would probably be a better idea. Look, the point here isn't really to prove that opium was bad or good, because I can't possibly oppose the decades of work that doctors and scientists have put in to tell us that it's not good for us. It's just weird to me that the Royal Commission created documentation to fairly study opium use in India, answering over 28,000 questions that were posed to them, and this massive document, split across 7 volumes, was instantly written off as biased or just serving as propaganda. And I kind of get that. In our post-truth world, believing anything that does not fit your narrative is just wrong or just written off without reconsideration or any consideration. And look, if you think I'm wrong and this was only the case with opium and I'm generalizing British reform because of this one problematic drug. Look, the British did a lot of reform, some of it was very good. They banned sati, which was obviously a social evil. But the British also boosted and taxed the sale of recreational cannabis, which, by the way, is one of the 5 plants listed in the Atharva Veda for curing anxiety. And later, they tried to ban it thrice between 1838 and 1871. So, the British had their heyday of making a lot of money over recreational cannabis, on opium, trading it to other countries, trading it inside India, and just making money off of it when it was popular. And then when they